The blizzard had been raging for hours, an unrelenting wall of white that swallowed the barren alien landscape whole. Snow howled through the broken crevices of the ship's hull, a symphony of chaos that was all too familiar to Captain Liam Hart. He tightened the frayed scarf around his neck, his breath puffing in visible clouds as he stared out at the endless frost. His shuttle was toast, a glowing hunk of smoldering metal half buried in the ice. The odds of survival? Slim to none. But Liam had never been one to quit. He'd barely escaped the crash, dragging what few supplies he could carry out into the storm. The beacon was busted, the emergency heater barely sputtered, and his comms were fried. If he didn't find shelter soon, he'd become just another frozen relic on this cursed planet. But then, she appeared. At first, Liam thought it was the cold playing tricks on his mind. A figure emerged through the snow, her silhouette glowing faintly against the storm's fury. She moved gracefully, almost too effortlessly for such a brutal environment. As she drew closer, he saw the blue of her skin, the shimmer of frost catching on her sleek form. She wasn't dressed for the weather, far from it. A skimpy outfit clung to her, metallic and alien, yet somehow radiant, like she belonged to the storm itself. Liam reached for his sidearm instinctively, though his fingers trembled too much to draw it. He wasn't sure what he expected from her, but it wasn't what came next. "Human," she said, her voice soft but firm, carrying over the howling wind as if the storm itself bent to her will. "You're freezing. Let me in." Her words were strange, a mix of perfect English and an accent that didn't belong to any Earth region. Liam narrowed his eyes, trying to figure out whether she was real or just some cruel hallucination. "What?" His voice cracked, his throat dry from the cold. She stepped closer, kneeling in the snow before him, her luminous eyes locking onto his. Her expression was desperate, almost pleading. "Let me into your shelter. I can help you. I promise." Liam's mind raced. His shelter. The pathetic excuse for a heater sputtering in the corner of the wreck. It wasn't even keeping him alive. And yet, there was something about her tone, her urgency, that struck a chord deep inside him. He wasn't sure if it was the desperation in her eyes or the sheer impossibility of her presence, but he couldn't look away. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the storm. "What are you?" "My name doesn't matter," she replied quickly, her words tumbling over one another. I'm not from here. But neither are you. Please, we don't have time for questions. You're dying out here, and I can't survive without your help." Her hands trembled as she reached out to him, as if touching him might convince him of her sincerity. Liam hesitated, every survival instinct screaming at him to stay cautious. He'd seen plenty of tricks, plenty of traps in his years as an explorer, but this was something else entirely. "Why should I trust you?" he demanded, his grip tightening on the useless sidearm. She flinched, her luminous eyes flickering with what looked like pain. "Because I have no choice," she whispered. "And neither do you. If we don't work together, we're both dead." Liam's heart pounded. She wasn't wrong. The storm was growing worse by the minute, and his options were non-existent. Still, letting a strange alien woman into his already fragile situation felt like trading one danger for another. He weighed his choices, every second feeling like an eternity, until finally, he nodded. "All right," he said gruffly. "But if you try anything," he didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. She nodded solemnly, a flicker of relief crossing her features. Together, they trudged through the snow, her movements graceful despite the biting wind. Liam couldn't help but steal glances at her. She was otherworldly, her blue skin glistening with frost, yet she didn't seem fazed by the cold. Her presence felt surreal, like something out of a dream, and yet she was undeniably real. When they reached the wreck, Liam ushered her inside, his hand never straying far from his sidearm. The heater's dim glow cast eerie shadows across the cramped space, but it was better than nothing. The woman knelt by the heater, her hands hovering over it as if testing its feeble warmth. She closed her eyes, and for a moment, Liam thought she might pray. Then, she turned to him, her expression resolute. "This isn't enough," she said. "We need more heat. Do you have anything else?" Liam shook his head. "That's all I've got," he admitted. It's barely keeping me alive as it is. She frowned, her eyes scanning the wreck with an intensity that made Liam uneasy. There might be another way, she said slowly, almost to herself. But it's risky. Riskier than freezing to death? Liam asked dryly. She gave him a small, sad smile. Maybe. But it's the only chance we have. Before he could ask what she meant, she placed her hand on the heater, her fingers glowing faintly as they made contact. Liam's eyes widened as the heater's sputtering flame roared to life, casting the entire space in a warm, golden glow. The sudden burst of heat was almost too much, and Liam stumbled back, staring at her in shock. "What did you do?" he demanded, his voice a mix of awe and suspicion. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "I kept my promise," she said simply. "But now you have to keep yours." Liam's stomach tightened. Something told him that whatever she wanted in return, it wasn't going to be simple. As the warmth seeped into his frozen limbs, melting the ice that had threatened to claim him, he realized that his decision to trust her had been only the first step in a much larger journey, one that he might not survive. The warmth radiating from the newly revived heater wasn't just physical, it brought with it a fragile hope that Liam hadn't felt in hours. The alien woman sat cross-legged on the floor of the wreck, her fingers faintly glowing as they hovered near the heater. Liam watched her cautiously, his mind spinning with questions he wasn't sure he wanted answers to. He gripped his sidearm, now resting in his lap, more for the illusion of control than any real intent to use it. "All right," he began, breaking the uneasy silence. "You've got some explaining to do. How did you do that?" She didn't look up immediately, her focus seemingly on the heater's glow. When she finally met his gaze, her expression was unreadable. "I channeled energy," she said simply. "My kind, we have an affinity for manipulating certain elements. Heat, in this case." "Your kind?" Liam pressed, his brow furrowing. "What are you, exactly?" "We call ourselves Lyrian," she replied, her voice soft but steady. "I'm from a world far from here. A world that no longer exists." Her eyes flickered with an emotion Liam couldn't quite place, grief, perhaps, or guilt. "Now I'm stranded, just like you." Liam's mind raced. 1,000 questions fought for dominance, but one in particular rose to the surface. "If you're stranded, then why aren't you freezing like I am? Why aren't you dead already?" The corner of her lips quirked up in a faint, humorless smile. "The Lyrian are adaptable," she said. "Our bodies can withstand extremes that would kill most species. But even I have my limits. Without heat, I wouldn't last much longer out there. Lucky for you, you stumbled onto my wreck," Liam muttered, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Lucky for us both," she corrected, her gaze steady. "I can keep the heater going, but I'll need something in return." Liam stiffened, his grip tightening on his sidearm. "What kind of something?" She hesitated, her fingers flexing as though searching for the right words. "My ship, it's not far from here. It's damaged, but the core, the heart of its power, is still intact. If we can reach it, we might both have a chance of survival. But I can't get there alone." "And you want me to help you," Liam said flatly. She nodded. "You're strong. Resilient. And you know this terrain better than I do. Together, we might make it." Liam laughed, a bitter sound that echoed through the wreck. "You want me to trek through that storm to find your ship? For what? A maybe?" He shook his head. "I don't even know if I can trust you." Her eyes softened, and for a moment, she looked almost human. "I understand your doubt," she said quietly. "But I have no reason to lie to you. My survival depends on yours. If we stay here, we'll both die. But if we try, if we take that risk, we might just make it." Liam wanted to argue, to tell her she was crazy, that he'd be better off taking his chances alone. But the truth was, he wasn't sure he'd make it another day without her help. And despite everything, there was something in her eyes, something raw and genuine, that made him want to believe her. "All right," he said finally, the word tasting like defeat. "We'll try. But I'm not doing this for free." Her lips curved into a small smile. "I wouldn't expect you to." They spent the next hour preparing. The alien woman, who still hadn't given him a name, proved resourceful, using parts from the wreck to fashion makeshift gear. She reinforced his tattered coat with reflective material and crafted a crude sled for carrying supplies. Liam watched her work, a mix of curiosity and skepticism gnawing at him. She moved with a purpose, her hands deft and confident, as though she'd done this 100 times before. "You've done this before," he said, voicing his thoughts aloud. She glanced at him, her expression guarded. "Something like it," she admitted. "Survival isn't new to me." "Care to elaborate?" he pressed. Her hands stilled for a moment, and she seemed to weigh her words carefully. "My people were explorers," she said finally. "We traveled to the edges of the galaxy, seeking knowledge, understanding. But exploration comes with risks. We encountered dangers we weren't prepared for. My ship, it was part of a fleet. Now it's all that's left." Liam frowned. "What happened to the rest of your fleet?" Her jaw tightened, and for a moment, she didn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "We trusted the wrong allies." Liam didn't press further. He could see the pain in her eyes, the weight of whatever had happened to her people. It wasn't his place to dig into wounds that were clearly still fresh. Instead, he focused on the task ahead. When the storm began to ease, they set out, the sled trailing behind them. The alien woman led the way, her movements swift and sure despite the uneven terrain. Liam followed, his breath fogging in the freezing air, every step a battle against the cold. The wind still cut through him like a knife, but the reinforced coat made it bearable. They walked in silence, the landscape around them a desolate expanse of white. Liam's mind wandered as they trudged forward, the questions he'd suppressed earlier rising to the surface. Who was this woman, really? What was she running from? And why did she seem so desperate to reach her ship's core? As if sensing his thoughts, she glanced back at him. "You're quiet," she said. "Just trying to conserve energy," he replied gruffly. She smiled faintly, her breath visible in the cold. "Smart. We'll need it. The closer we get to my ship, the more dangerous it will become." "Dangerous how?" he asked, his hand instinctively resting on his sidearm. Her expression darkened. "There are creatures on this planet. Predators. They're drawn to the energy signature of my ship. If they find us first," she didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. Liam's grip tightened on his weapon. He'd faced predators before, but something told him these weren't the kind he was used to. Still, he wasn't about to back out now. Not when survival was within reach. As they pressed on, the air grew heavier, the silence broken only by the crunch of snow beneath their boots. The sense of unease grew with each step, an invisible weight pressing down on them. Liam couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, but when he glanced over his shoulder, the landscape was empty. They were alone. For now. The snow had taken on an eerie stillness, the kind that made every crunch underfoot sound deafening. Liam's instincts screamed at him that something was wrong. The alien woman walked a few paces ahead, her luminous blue skin almost glowing against the endless white. She seemed tense, her movements sharper and more deliberate than before. Whatever creatures she'd warned him about, they were close, he could feel it. "How much farther?" he called, his voice hushed but firm. She turned to look at him, her expression grim. "Not far," she said. "But the closer we get, the more dangerous it becomes. They can sense us." Liam gritted his teeth. He'd faced danger before: pirates, hostile wildlife, even mutiny, but there was something about this situation that felt different. Primal. His hand stayed close to his sidearm, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. The landscape began to change subtly. The ground beneath the snow became uneven, dotted with jagged rocks and strange crystalline formations that sparkled faintly in the dim light. The air grew colder, biting into Liam's exposed skin despite the reinforced coat. He noticed the alien woman shiver slightly, her earlier composure slipping just enough to remind him that she wasn't invincible. "What exactly are we walking into?" Liam asked, his tone sharper than he intended. She glanced at him, her luminous eyes shadowed by worry. "The core of my ship is a powerful energy source. It's what keeps it operational, even in a dormant state. But that energy, it attracts things. Predators. Scavengers. Creatures that shouldn't exist." Liam's stomach tightened. And you didn't think to mention this earlier? Would it have changed your mind? She countered, her voice tinged with defiance. We're here now. Arguing won't help. He didn't respond, but the frustration simmered beneath the surface. He'd agreed to help her, but he was beginning to wonder if he'd just signed his own death warrant. The first sign of danger came as a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. Liam froze, his heart pounding as his eyes darted around. The alien woman stopped too, her head tilting slightly as if she could hear something he couldn't. They're close, she whispered. How close? He asked, his voice barely audible. She didn't answer, but the tension in her body told him everything he needed to know. Liam drew his sidearm, the cold metal reassuring in his grip. His eyes scanned the terrain, searching for any sign of movement. The growl came again, this time louder, followed by the unmistakable sound of crunching snow. Stay close to me, she said, her voice steady despite the fear flickering in her eyes. Liam didn't argue. He positioned himself slightly behind her, his weapon raised. The crunching grew louder, the sound echoing around them as if the source was everywhere and nowhere at once. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it, a flash of movement, too fast to fully register. There, he shouted, spinning to face the direction of the movement. But whatever it was had already disappeared, leaving only the disturbed snow in its wake. Don't waste your shots, the alien woman said sharply. They're testing us. Testing us, he repeated incredulously. What are they, some kind of alien wolves? She didn't answer, her focus entirely on the shifting shadows around them. The tension was suffocating, every second stretching into an eternity. Then, with a suddenness that made Liam's blood run cold, one of the creatures appeared. It was massive, its body covered in jagged, crystalline fur that seemed to refract the faint light. Its eyes glowed an unnatural green, and its jaws were lined with razor-sharp teeth that glistened with frost. It stood on 4 powerful legs, its movements almost feline as it circled them, its growl low and menacing. Liam raised his sidearm, aiming directly at the creature's head. Stay back, he warned, though he doubted the creature would understand. The alien woman stepped forward slightly, her hands glowing faintly as she held them out in front of her. The creature paused, its glowing eyes narrowing as it regarded her. You can't fight it, she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the pounding of Liam's heart. What do you suggest, then? He asked, not lowering his weapon. Let me handle it, she said. Before he could protest, she took another step forward, her glowing hands brightening as she spoke softly in a language Liam didn't understand. The creature growled, its crystalline fur bristling as it crouched low, preparing to pounce. Liam's finger hovered over the trigger, every muscle in his body screaming at him to act. But then, something incredible happened. The alien woman's glow intensified, casting a warm, golden light over the snow. The creature hesitated, its glowing eyes flickering as if caught in a trance. Liam watched, his breath caught in his throat, as the creature slowly backed away. It growled one last time before turning and disappearing into the storm, its massive form vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. The silence that followed was deafening. Liam lowered his sidearm, his hands trembling slightly. What the hell was that? He demanded, his voice a mix of awe and anger. The alien woman turned to him, her expression weary but relieved. One of the guardians of this land, she said simply. They're drawn to the energy of the core. I persuaded it to let us pass. Persuaded, he repeated, his tone incredulous. You mean you've been able to do that this whole time, and you didn't think to mention it? It doesn't always work, she admitted, her voice heavy with exhaustion. And if it hadn't, we'd both be dead. So perhaps save your questions for later. Liam clenched his jaw but said nothing. She was right, they didn't have time for arguments. The encounter had only reinforced the danger they were in, and he doubted they'd get so lucky next time. Come on, she said, her voice softer now. We're almost there. He nodded, following her as she led the way through the increasingly treacherous terrain. Every step felt heavier, the weight of what lay ahead pressing down on him. But despite the fear gnawing at his resolve, he couldn't help but feel a spark of determination. They'd made it this far. Whatever waited for them at her ship, he was ready to face it. The wreckage of the alien woman's ship loomed in the distance, a skeletal silhouette half buried in ice. Its metallic surface shimmered faintly, pulsing with the energy she had described. But what caught Liam's attention most were the dark shapes moving around it. Predators. Guardians. Whatever they were, they seemed to guard the wreck as if it were their own. "We're here," she said, her voice tinged with both relief and apprehension. "And so are they," Liam muttered, nodding toward the creatures prowling the site. There were at least 3, their crystalline forms glinting ominously in the dim light. She glanced at him, her expression grim. "They won't let us take the core without a fight." "Great," he said dryly, tightening his grip on his sidearm. "Any other tricks up your sleeve?" She hesitated, her glowing hands flexing as she considered her response. "I might be able to distract them long enough for you to reach the core. But it'll take everything I have." Liam frowned, his gut twisting at her words. "And what happens to you?" "That doesn't matter," she said firmly, her eyes locking onto his. "What matters is that one of us survives. The core can power your ship, save your life. If I don't make it, at least it won't be for nothing." "No," he said immediately, shaking his head. "We're doing this together. We both get out of here, or neither of us does." She stared at him, surprised by his conviction. "Why would you risk your life for me?" she asked softly. "Because that's what humans do," he said simply. "We don't leave people behind." Her expression softened, and for the first time since they met, she smiled. It was a small, fleeting smile, but it carried a warmth that cut through the cold. "All right," she said. "Together, then." They devised a plan quickly, knowing they had little time before the creatures noticed them. She would use her abilities to create a barrier of heat and light, forcing the predators to keep their distance, while Liam made his way to the core. Once he retrieved it, they'd retreat together, using the core's energy to deter the creatures long enough to escape. The execution was anything but smooth. As soon as she began channeling her energy, the creatures turned their attention to her, their glowing eyes narrowing as they snarled and paced. The air crackled with heat, a shimmering wall of light surrounding her as she stood her ground. Liam didn't waste a second, sprinting toward the ship's wreckage with the sled dragging behind him. Inside the ship, the air was thick with tension. The core glowed in the center of the wreck, a sphere of pulsating light that seemed almost alive. It was encased in a protective shell, but years of damage had weakened its barriers. Liam approached cautiously, his heart pounding as he reached out to touch it. The moment his fingers made contact, a surge of energy coursed through him, making his vision blur and his body tremble. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stay focused as he detached the core from its housing and secured it in the sled. Outside, the situation had deteriorated. The creatures had grown bolder, pressing against the barrier as they tested its strength. The alien woman was visibly weakening, her glow flickering as she struggled to maintain the shield. "Liam," she called, her voice strained. "Hurry." "I'm coming," he shouted, dragging the sled behind him as he sprinted back toward her. The creatures snarled, their crystalline forms glinting as they turned their attention to him. One lunged, its massive claws narrowly missing him as he dove to the ground. "Get down," she shouted, and a wave of heat surged outward, forcing the creature to retreat. But the effort left her staggering, her knees buckling as the glow around her dimmed. Liam scrambled to his feet, grabbing her arm to steady her. "Come on," he said. "We're almost there." Together, they retreated, the core's energy radiating in a way that seemed to repel the creatures. They growled and paced at the edge of the energy field, but they didn't follow. By the time they reached the relative safety of Liam's wrecked ship, both of them were on the verge of collapse. The core fit seamlessly into the ship's damaged power system, its energy flooding the interior with light and warmth. For the first time in what felt like forever, Liam felt the crushing weight of survival begin to lift. He turned to the alien woman, who sat slumped against the wall, her skin pale and her breathing shallow. "You did it," he said, his voice soft with gratitude. "We did it," she corrected, a faint smile on her lips. He knelt beside her, his expression serious. "You need to rest. The core's energy, can it heal you?" She nodded weakly. "It will take time, but I'll recover." For a while, neither of them spoke, the warmth of the ship's revived systems enveloping them like a blanket. Liam stared out at the storm raging beyond the ship's walls, a profound sense of relief washing over him. They had survived. Against all odds, they had survived. "You risked everything for me," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why?" He looked at her, his gaze steady. "Because I couldn't have done it without you. And because if there's one thing I've learned out here, it's that survival means nothing if you lose your humanity along the way." Her eyes glistened, and for a moment, she looked more human than alien. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with emotion. Liam nodded, a faint smile on his lips. "Get some rest. We've got a lot of work ahead of us." As she closed her eyes, her breathing evening out, Liam sat back, letting the warmth seep into his bones. The storm outside raged on, but inside, there was peace. They had fought, they had survived, and they had found something far more valuable than just survival. They had found trust, connection, and the strength to face whatever came next. In the end, Liam realized, survival wasn't just about staying alive. It was about holding on to hope, even in the darkest moments. And in that hope, they had found a future worth fighting for.